Well, welcome everybody. This is, I think, the 8th session of this Bible study, so it's been a long time. And I think this is the 3rd to last session, so we have like 10 total. Yes. Yep. Well, I should know. I made it, so don't worry. You can't know. Okay. So we're going to do 2 more after this. We're going to talk about, I included a psalm, Psalm 51, which David is said to have written right after this next week. And then the last time we're going to look at old David and at the fight for succession of his throne. Another interesting story there. So either way, welcome to this session. Last week we talked about 2 Samuel chapter 11, about how David kind of was in the temple and looked out the temple windows and realized, hey, wait a minute, you know what, this Ark of the, like I'm here in my temple made of cedar and fancy materials, and out there's the Ark of the Covenant of God, right? Sitting in a tent, basically. So David said, you know what, I want to build you a house, but God ultimately said, no, you're not going to build me a house. Instead, I'm going to build you a house. And that was kind of a play on words, actually, because it kind of meant, because house can also mean dynasty. So what God said basically was, I will build you a dynasty that will last forever. That was basically last week's story. This week's story is obviously a little bit different. And I would say, let's just start out reading it. Can somebody read for me 2 Samuel chapter 11, the first 13 verses, 1 through 13.
I can do part of them.
Perfect. Okay, that's good. I'll hop in where you stop. So,
in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark in Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live," is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. "And as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house.
Thank you so much, Carol. All right. Was a tad bit to read, right? But we get the juicy part of the story right up front.
That's right.
All right, so what happened here? What happened? What have we just read?
Well, did Uriah find out that his wife had been with David? Is that why he didn't go home?
Good point. No, actually not. What is happening here in these verses is very interesting. According to Deuteronomy chapter 23, it was not prohibited for a warrior to just go and sleep in a house while his fellow warriors or while they were in battle. Or actually, having sex with a woman was prohibited while being in battle. So the whole, like, when David invites him to wash his feet, apparently that was a euphemistic language for go and sleep with your wife. So basically what happens is Uriah has no clue, at least not that we know of. It is not necessarily told. All it says here is basically David. I think what happens here is David has a plan to kind of push the child on Uriah, instead of keeping it on him. So in stage one, obviously, is already very seductive, right? Come home from battle, Uriah, where you could always die the next day, right? I mean, let's face it, we live a very comfortable life in peace times, but if you're a soldier out on the battlefield, especially back for Israel's time, right, when they didn't really have a technological advantage and couldn't fire farther than the enemies and whatnot, tomorrow was not promised to you, right? Like every day you were literally risking your life, and you were risking it very strongly so. So, yeah, it was probably quite a nice invitation to potentially see your wife for the last time. But Uriah says, I'm not going to do it. In fact, Uriah actually even, he kind of has promised King David to be truthful to him, right, and to be loyal to him. And his loyalty is not broken by that kind of promise. I think he even swears on David here in one point, right? As true as you live, and as and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing. So, very strongly saying no. And obviously, that also stands in huge contrast to David's disloyalty to Uriah and Bathsheba and God and everyone else involved, right? I mean, kind of David is burning a few bridges here. It's not just that one.
And his nation.
And his nation.
Yeah.
Good point. That's right. Absolutely. Are there any other questions?
He does sin after sin after sin. So one sin leads to another sin, and this is part of the domino effect of why sin can lead to other problems. I mean, if he is a king and a warrior, he really David should probably be out in front lines, but instead he's back at home getting in trouble.
See?
And so he's not showing loyalty to his country, and he's not being admirable. It's admirable when you see a leader getting out in danger, harm's way, and being informed of actually what's going on in the battlefield in the country.
Excuse me.
So he's messing around, and rather than he cheats. Then he tries to cover it up by trying to have the husband have sex with Bathsheba. But then, because leading the next step, which is coming, going to basically plot to murder him, but to make it look like it was a battlefield casualty rather than a direct murder.
Okay.
So it's deception.
So now you're going ahead in the story, but you're on point there. That's right. And Doug, you hit a couple of important points there. One is really, David is kind of on a slippery slope here, right? One thing kind of leads to another. It starts with adultery, which is already a bad place to start, right? But to kind of continue with deception, with, trying to really kind of lying to Uriah in one way or another, right? And also lying to Israel is kind of bad. Getting him drunk, trying to make him really break the law, break the law of the Lord, which kind of a big deal too, right? It just kind of continues, and obviously the story will reach its climax in the verses to come, right? And the other piece is also, you're right, Doug. David technically should have been on the front lines with his soldiers. And so far, that's what we've always seen him do, haven't we? Right? He was always right there. He was always praying to the Lord, should I do this? How should I do this? How are you going to help me? None of that right here, right? He is lying about. He's just kind of sleeping. Napping and other kinds of sleeping as well.
He's living it up.
Yeah. While his soldiers are really kind of going to war, and that is why I have 1 Samuel chapter 8 included in our slides today. if we go to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and just look at the 10 verses from about verse 10 through verse 20, that basically was the part before Saul was right before Saul was crowned king. Where all the people of Israel kind of came to Samuel and said, well, Samuel, you're the head prophet. You're the guy who's talking to God. We want a king, okay? We want somebody to govern us. We want somebody to be in charge. And we want somebody who's going ahead for us, into battle. And then Samuel kind of goes to God, lifts the whole matter up, and here's what God says, right? So Samuel reported all the words. This is verse 10. So 1 Samuel 8, verse 10. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen, and so forth. You will appoint for himself commanders. And then if we skip down to verse 13, he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. So basically, at least what it's saying here is, right, that the king will kind of take. He won't even ask, he'll just kind of take. And what do we see David do here? David sends for Bathsheba. He takes her, right, and she conceives a child. So that's actually also very violent language. To take a woman can also technically mean to have, it implies that they had intercourse with one another. And I mean, this text is very kind of brief. It's sort of just, there's not a whole bunch of emotion to it. It's almost kind of like a report. Here's kind of what happened. And it's very succinct too. It doesn't give us too much. It might be a rape or it might not be a rape. But whatever it was kind of David kind of sent to her with the intention to sleep with Bathsheba. That was his point. The idea was not even to have a child. The only idea was really to sleep with her. Are you having any questions, Carol? I just saw your eyebrow kind of like go,
No, my feelings about David have kind of tumbled.
Oh, yeah. This story kind of brings him down, doesn't it? It's kind of a tough one. That's
also,
true.
He was God's chosen person. He was a hero.
Yeah. Up to this point, he really was. Yeah.
Goliath in a battle.
Yep.
And yet he's gone from such a high place to such a low place. So now he's
Yep.
total.
Yeah, I mean, it is terrible, right? It is terrible.
But jumping even farther ahead, he manages to get back into God's graces, but pays a severe price and may not be as high of a notch, but he's got to go through a lot of insurrection or whatever you want to call it.
Oh yeah. That is tough. That's true, and we're going to talk about that more towards the end of today's lesson. But it is. You're right. I mean, it is tough to see, right? It is astounding to see what David kind of does here. So another thing I wanted to do is I've kind of missed to do that. But really, his troops were out, in the meantime, fighting the Ammonites, and the capital was called Rabbah. Rabbah was just kind of like southeast of the 12 tribes of Israel. It was kind of far off of the Jordan. That's kind of where everything went, right? And that's where he would ultimately send Uriah back to as well. For them to fight. All right. Did I want to tell you anything else about Uriah? Let me see. I think I said earlier already, right? There's kind of a I want to say dichotomy. Just there's a very big difference, right, between the way Uriah is portrayed here and the way David is portrayed, right? Up to this point, David was always the hero. He was always the one who went into battle, who went ahead, who was kind of brave, who was following God's word. I mean, just top to bottom, right? It was perfect. Today, it's almost like Uriah kind of slips in that spot. And David is almost, he gets, he's closer to the image that we got from like people like Saul, right? In the beginning, in the earlier chapters, that kind of sluggish king who doesn't do what he was called to do, right? While he sits on the couch and is far away from the battlefield, right? Uriah is the one who keeps the law and who is more than willing to go back to the battle whenever he is called, which is indeed very heroic behavior. And the other part is what Uriah demonstrates here, right? Even in the verses, even as he's tempted by David again and again, is he has concern not only for his men, but also for the Ark of the Covenant, right? That is really mentioned here, which we saw David have last week, right? He wanted to build the Ark a house, right? He wanted to build God a house. And today, David doesn't even care. There's no consideration for the Ark whatsoever. It's all about, it kind of shifts here. David's interest almost in everything we see shifts from the public, from worrying about Israel and God, to the personal. From being really the strong man to kind of going to a form of vulnerability. And it really kind of, and the story from here on out will also shift from really from blessing, from David being blessed continuously and the Lord being with him all this time, to a curse. We will talk more about that in just a little bit. Good deal. One of the things I really wondered about here is also like, why does David sleep on the rooftop? I was like, what kind of a palace is that? You have this beautiful house and only to have a couch on top of the roof. But I found out actually the rooftop is actually the best place to sleep, or was back then, because it's kind of cooler. There's wind blowing. So I'm assuming they had some sort of like gazebo or something for him probably, so he was covered by covered from the sun. Kind of just awoke from his afternoon nap, and there he saw Bathsheba, who was, obviously off on the other side, or on another rooftop, I guess, bathing. I'm not sure how common the bathing on the rooftop was. The text doesn't say. But interestingly enough, right, if we look at Bathsheba and the way she's being treated, how often did you hear the name Bathsheba? Did anyone pay attention to that?
Maybe twice.
Yeah.
Maybe
Just
twice,
when
right?
They introduce her.
They introduce her there, right?
Give her
Yeah.
her name. This is Bathsheba.
That's right. And honestly,
And
that's,
identify her.
yeah.
And that's kind of it.
And that is it. Exactly, Tammy. That is it. Apart from that, she will either be called woman or the wife of Uriah the Hittite. There is no more mentioning of Bathsheba. And if you think about it, right, she has not yet taken any kind of active stance at all, right? She's just kind of like, oh, I was sent for him, Then he kind of went and laid with me, and I went back, and then she let him know, hey, by the way, I'm pregnant, right? That's about it. It's Bathsheba kind of here is very much an object, rather than just like somebody who's actually actively doing something in the story. And we will see this continue pretty much throughout the end of what we're reading here today. I mean, it's Bathsheba is almost treated like a piece of furniture by the text, really.
That's the way women were treated a lot back then.
To an extent, right? But if we compare that, for example, to what we've seen with Michal, right? With Saul's daughter, how she loved David, how she went for him, how she actually just, how she cut him down to size after he was dancing around naked in front of the ark. There's still
That was the exception.
Yeah. I mean, and you're right. Sure, women were not on one level with man back then, but it is fascinating to see, just how passive.
Because her name
Bathsheba
was in that a lot. They
Yeah.
always referred to her by name.
Yeah,
in
usually they
that
would have.
passage,
Yeah,
in that part.
yeah,
She
and
was always referred to by name.
yeah, but Bathsheba wasn't, right?
And we
It's
all
just
know that name, and we know the story so well, and her name's only in there one time.
very
That's
true.
really interesting.
Very true, right? Good deal. Yep. And interestingly enough, too, right? If we think about this story, I mean, you know what? I'm sure you understand. I mean, the women among you might know this much better than us guys. But there's this comment in here, right? Right in in verse 4. Now she was purifying herself after her period. That was only in there to let us know the child was going to be David's. There was no way Uriah was the father. She had just had her period. Uriah was out in battle. There was no other suitor here. There was no one else who could have been, sneaking in. So honestly, no excuse, right?
Well, I think that means also that she was trying to be observant of the law, because women were supposed to purify themselves.
Well, that too. Yep. But it certainly also clarifies, right? Hey, I'm doing this here. Yeah. And I think a lot has been also read into these verses in terms of, oh, Bathsheba was seducing David, with her beauty, and she was bathing on the rooftop. Honestly, if we really read this text, though, does it give us any of that? Not really, right? Honestly, the text is really focused, and that's kind of cool about the text, too. It kind of keeps David accountable, right? It's not focused on what Bathsheba has or has not done. And we don't really learn anything about Bathsheba's intention about bathing on the rooftop. Maybe she wanted to get a little cool draft, too. We certainly don't hear anything about Bathsheba being seductive or doing it on purpose or having kind of plotted something up, to seduce David and catch him.
The only thing that's suspicious is bathing on the roof.
I'm not sure how common that was or not, to be honest.
It doesn't really say that she was bathing on a roof. It just says he saw from the roof a woman bathing.
Oh, there we go.
It doesn't really say where
My bad.
but she's
Yep.
necessarily
My bad.
on
Yep.
another roof.
You're right. You caught me off guard there, Tammy. That's true.
Because
Yeah.
he's standing up and just looking around, and there she is.
Yeah, I'm thinking of
But
the movie.
it doesn't really, it doesn't necessarily say that.
Yeah, and bathing wasn't necessarily something they did regularly, was it?
No.
It's probably not in the same amount, not as often
Right,
perhaps
not
as we
daily
did it.
or-
Yeah,
Right.
usually
But
not.
that's why it also kind of makes sense that it would have been on the roof, because it would have been a more pleasurable thing, But she was
Or-
doing it outside in the sun, maybe.
Maybe, who
And if
knows?
you're
You
not
know.
bathing, where do you, they didn't I don't think they had bathrooms as such.
Who knows?
Because
Yeah.
they didn't bathe
Yeah.
that much.
And you know what, Tammy, you're probably right. She might have just not done that on the rooftop. Honestly, we don't know where it is because it just isn't in the
Assume that
text.
he looked out and she was right there at his
Yep.
left, eye level.
And he might have looked through the window. Yeah.
Yeah, she could have been inside a cover somehow that was open though.
Yeah.
And he could just see in there.
That's
but
true.
we don't-
Did you read the
can't
red
really tell.
tent? Okay, because in that, and that was, would that have been before this time or, well, I think.
I can't remember who was involved in it to figure out the time.
It was another book that we had read, and but it was a long time ago because the families were all out in the desert.
Yeah.
And there would be a father and the daughters, then he would
Yeah.
marry off. But you had to get approval and such, and they would travel from place to place. Okay, and they talked in there about the red tent because that's where women went when they were having their periods.
Oh,
and they spent their time
okay.
in the tent, away from the men. And so that's why I'm thinking that on the bathing, that would have been something they would have done after that, but I'm not sure how much people all
Who
as a
knows?
whole bathed,
Yeah.
if they weren't near a river or something.
I'm not sure about that either. I'm not sure if we know how often they
And
bathe.
that sure doesn't
Probably
give you anything.
not.
No.
That doesn't give you anything.
No, it doesn't
to
give you anything.
tell.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, but I've heard about the red tent. Wasn't it that skimpy novel that you read when Pastor Santiago
Yes,
was gone
yes.
here at the book club? Yeah, I heard about the red
Yeah,
tent.
he didn't want to have any part of reading that when it came up for mention. So yes, in between we read it, yes. But it was an interesting book in the sense
Okay.
it did tell a lot about
Okay.
of the differences in the tribes and their religions and
Yeah.
such, what went on. So it was good.
Sounds enlightening enough, though, so. The skimpy Lutheran advice. Read the red tent.
Open your eyes.
Yes. All right. Let us continue with the story. Can somebody read for me the rest of chapter 11, verses 14 through 27, that is?
Okay, I can do that. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Job and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." As Job was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Job, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Then Job sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises, and if he says to you, 'Why did you go so near that city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed
Abimelech, yeah.
Yes, a son of Jerubbaal. Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at the Bez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead too.'" So the messenger went and came and told David all that Job had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite was dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Job, 'Do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him.'" When the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so now we're all still familiar with that part of the story, I guess, right? More or less. Are there any new insights you've gained from just reading these verses right now?
He's in bad trouble.
He's in bad trouble. Okay.
Well, he has several of his own men killed,
Yes.
covering up his sin, and
Yes.
his objective should be to win the war and serve God, which he's ain't doing.
He
Yep.
made a sidetrack.
Yep.
So he's messing up bad.
That is true. That is true. Are there any questions you have about these verses that we read?
They were pretty clear.
Okay, they were pretty clear.
Yeah, and I don't think I'd ever read them before.
Oh, okay. Good
Kind of
deal.
opened my eyes about David.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh.
he always knew that there was something, he had not obeyed God, obviously, when he ended up with Bathsheba, but never had that much detail on it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's true. Right? What we see here. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you going
No, I just wondered, the messenger doesn't tell David exactly what he was told to say. He
No.
says, was that just to save time? Or
Maybe.
is that-
Maybe.
or is
I
that
wonder how
typical
many
David
times
trying
that.
to forget, you know?
It could be, especially if we think about it, right? I mean, I don't know how long the messenger was underway, and Ammon wasn't necessarily all that far off, but if you come back to David 1 or 2 days later, right? We know our minds, right? They do tend to forget, and even though I'm assuming that these messengers, they probably, their capacity to remember was probably better than ours, because that's what they had to do and they trained to do. Yeah. Whereas, I mean, with all due respect, right? Well, we today just can look up anything,
Yeah.
right? So,
He had
just
time
that.
to think about it, and I thought, well, maybe as he thought
Yeah.
about it, he thought, no, I'll just kind of work it up this way and throw that in without
could be.
waiting to see if he gets
Yeah.
mad, and I'll just do that. And
Yeah.
he was allowed to do that, I guess.
And I feel like he's almost
It
a little bit
worked.
defensive, right? The messengers, because he kind of just throws in, yeah, we lost some people, but David, Uriah the Hittite is dead too. Just doesn't even wait for it, right? And we don't even hear David being mad at all.
Right,
It's
so-
David just kind of says, well, that is the way of the war, right?
Yeah.
The sword devours one now and another one later. Just Joab, keep your heads up. It's every battle, right, demands its sacrifice
and if
kind of
the messenger
thing.
had been doing this kind of thing for a while, maybe he kind of knew, here's what he told
Yeah.
us, but I know how to work this, 'cause
Yeah.
I've been doing this a while, I
Yeah.
know how to work this, and he just did it smoother and shorter.
That's true.
And
That's
to the
true.
point, and it worked.
Yep. That could have been too. That could have definitely been. The ironic part about it is, right, David probably thought at this point, well, the sword is, it just is what it is, right, and it's going to stay in the war. But soon enough, the death and destruction, the havoc he's kind of wreaked among his own forces, right, the family of Uriah and Bathsheba, and among others is soon going to come visit him as well. We will see some of that today. Some of it you can read up on your own if you want to in the following chapters there. It really will start in chapter 13, but I think I'm going to talk more about that in just a little bit. But what we see here really is kind of stage 3 of David's master plan, right? Of getting rid of Uriah or getting rid of or covering it up, right? We saw the whole invitation to go to your wife didn't work. Making you drunk and inviting you to go to your wife didn't work. Now we have step 3, right? And that is just get flat out rid of you. And that is actually scary if we think about how much it has escalated, right? The first thing might have almost been like a white lie to us, even though it was already breaking the law, right? But now he goes to flat out murder the person, right? So you cover up the sins that you did against one of the 10 commandments by basically committing another sin and having Uriah killed there in battle.
He's also putting his whole country at risk by wasting his men.
Yeah. He's definitely weakening his own country, that's true. And his own forces, absolutely. Absolutely. And it also makes obvious, right, how that deadly spiral of sin is kind of going on, right? How it just kind of keeps escalating
But
from
through
here.
it all, and he keeps that moving and keeps covering his tracks and doing this. God knows. So what are you doing? Why are you messing with the rest of this? Because God knows what you did. So why are you even bothering with this?
And you know what? I think the answer is probably right in front of our face and has been right in front of our faces so many times in these past years, right? If we think about it, there have been sex abuse scandals on so many people, right? Or the children on so many people, right? And we talk about elected officials. We talk about folks who wear a tab collar like I do. Even it was hard for me to first put these things on when I started pastoring because it's kind of like, man, I'm sorry, I look like a pedophile now. That's almost what it feels like, right? And it used to be just like, hey, you're in office of the Lord, and that's why we're still wearing these things, right? Is to kind of show that and express that, right? But initially, like the stereotype now is, especially, if you wear one of these, you might like little boys and girls, and that's that in and of itself is kind of sad, right? But many of the folks who ultimately got busted, right, for child abuse or sexual abuse in general, tried to cover it up, right? At least for some time. There's always, I think, that push for us to probably be ashamed of it, feel guilty about it, and yes, we're going to answer to the Lord for it. But before then, we try to keep face, right, in front of humans. We might, at least, this was probably different in David's time. I would say it was different in David's time. In our time, we might be like, look, God at the end of the day is gracious, and I might get away with something. But people aren't gracious, right? And sexual abuse is one of those. You're definitely going to get rid of your job, and your life from now on is going to change hard. So I'm guessing, he would have probably lost his reputation as a good king. He might have lost the crown, and he might have lost his people over this scandal as well. I'm guessing at this point, to be honest, but there's definitely a guilt and a shame aspect, I think, that plays a role in David trying to cover it up.
Well, he's kind of lying to himself,
yeah.
trying to cover it for himself.
Yep.
Really. Would it have made a difference if she had not gotten pregnant? Would that have made any difference in all of this? Was it because of the child and the proof of what he did?
Probably.
Made it more.
Yeah. He probably nothing would have probably really happened,
right,
if it wouldn't have been for her pregnancy, I would say.
Well, this is also like a close friend, the general or whatever, and he's betraying one of his best friends or co-workers, or So it's a violation on so many different levels.
Yeah. And we read about Uriah the Hittite again a little later, I think at the end when David makes one of his last speeches in his life, one of his final speeches, I think, where he kind of like even praises, just so many people, like, hey, Joab, you've always been with me, my general. And he kind of mentions his elite 30. Uriah the Hittite was one of the elite 30 he had. So an aging old David I think it's in 2 Samuel chapter 23. He even mentions Uriah the Hittite. So he got rid of one of his best, one of his best men on the battlefield, just with that move, just because of the lust, Quite impressive, really. And then when we come to verses 26 and 27, right, it was that, everything kind of seems to go according to plan, at least for the time being, right? At least for the moment. Bathsheba mourns. 7 days is the traditional mourning period, so she mourned for a week, and went through all the customs that might have been involved with that. And after that, David initially, honestly, he kind of gets to play the good Samaritan, we would probably say here, right? He gets to say, "Oh, the poor widow." Being a widow, right, is never fun, but back then it was especially hard, right? If you didn't have anyone to take care of you, and there wasn't really a job market for women in the same sense. You were kind of on your own, and you were facing harsh realities. But David to kind of, and David could probably even act like he was coming to the rescue here, except he didn't. Except he was kind of the cause of the problem.
Awful.
It really is awful, right?
It is. What a nice guy, yeah.
Exactly. And the problem about, I think, this entire David, Uriah, and Bathsheba story is, I think, all the time, pretty much since antiquity on, we have always tried to soften the story on different ends, and have tried to kind of deflect blame from David and kind of push it on someone else. There was the whole scapegoating attempts, right? Bathsheba, you were seducing him. What were you thinking? Bathing your beautiful body so nakedly for the king to see, right? That kind of thing. She was probably, that was probably a conspiracy against, or an attack on David. She was just trying to, really to seduce him. Then there were different approaches of rationalizing, of kind of making Uriah out to be the bad guy. Even some of the Jewish rabbis have tried to do that sometimes and said, well, if he was a Hittite, then trying to include her back into the people of God was a good thing, right, for David as a Hebrew to marry her into. That was one attempt back in antiquity, or still in ancient times, and another one was to just try to say, well, Uriah was an abusive husband, or he was a bad husband to her, or things like that. But the text just doesn't give us that. Exactly, it doesn't really say that, right? It just briefly narrates what happens, and everything else is kind of what we carry into the text, instead of what we kind of pull out of it and what we get out of it. And I think the third aspect was that we kind of tried to romanticize it and say, well, but David and Bathsheba, they really loved each other, right? Just like in that movie that you saw, Claire, when you were young, right?
Yes.
It's as we see, and wouldn't that be a wonderful? It's a wonderful story, right? Because we all know what happens to David and Bathsheba, right? Obviously, he took her into his house, so she's part of his harem now, really. She joins the flock of wives that he has by now, right? Marries her, she gives birth to a son, and ultimately her son Solomon will become the next king. And what a great king he was. It would only be fitting if they loved each other, right? That would be perfect for our eyes. But unfortunately, it's not what the text says. And the truth is, romances and loving relationships do not begin with taking, whatever that meant, right? But with the man kind of going, come here.
But at the same time, it doesn't say that he didn't love her.
It does. Yeah, that is true.
Basically, it says that they did get along and such, but he did have other wives.
He did have other wives, yeah.
Right.
The text is silent about a lot of things here, right? But at the same time, just if we think about David's behavior here, right?
But this son goes on to be, the son from them, though, does go on to be a king.
We will read more about that in just a minute, Claire.
Okay.
Yes, because there's a little twist.
I meant so maybe there was the idea that that particular son went on. Because I'm sure he had other sons, right?
Oh yeah.
So how does it come about which son?
We'll read up on that in coming sessions, actually, so the week after next. For right now.
You can tell I haven't read too much ahead.
and don't worry about it, it's okay. I'm glad to.
Continue next week.
Exactly. Or 2 weeks from today. Yes, but it is interesting. Yes, to kind of answer or ask that question, right? I mean, I sometimes wonder maybe by then they were all old and Bathsheba was just knew how to work her cards, on the king's court, as well. That might have been the other option. But if we think about what we do know, right, it is basically David looking, just kind of looking from the rooftop, spotting a woman, sending for her, and taking her. They didn't even go on a date, that's probably not how it worked, but there's no interest, as it seems, in really a relationship. There's interest in laying with her, sleeping with her, and if she probably wouldn't have said that she conceived anything, then he didn't have to get rid of Uriah. There's no other communication really, except for
she
David
sent
doing what he
word to
does.
him that she was pregnant. She didn't even
Yeah.
They were talking that day, and she let him know.
Yeah.
She sent word to him. So
That's true. Yep. Exactly. So that's at least how we get to the point of like, oh, you know what? I think David was probably more interested in sleeping with her than anything else. All right. Now let's read chapter 12, the first 14 verses. Can somebody do that for me? Cool.
I thought it was interesting in the King James Version. See the first sentence there, right before.
Yeah.
It says, "But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." That's the end of chapter 11. In the King James Version, that
interesting.
is tacked on at the end of chapter 11, and here it's a continuation of chapter 11. Verse 1 doesn't start until after that phrase.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, "There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, 'As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity.' Nathan said to David, 'You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you to your master's house, and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun.' David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, Now the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die." Then Nathan went to his house.
Thank you, Tammy. All right. Any questions, comments, anything new you have learned? It's quite a lot packed into the story, isn't there? See, we've already seen Nathan last week. He was kind of a chief prophet, I guess, or an important prophet in David's court. He only appears in a couple of places, really, namely here, and last week we had him as well in chapter 7 at least, where we kind of saw, where he kind of promised, right, that in the name of the Lord, that the Lord would give David a house, a dynasty, not David, the Lord, a temple house kind of thing. So here he kind of comes back, right, and he tells this good old parable, which is, it's interesting, it's kind of said, if we could read Hebrew, we would see this is kind of like, it sounds a little bit like it's court language, like this is a court case. But at the same time, David understands what Nathan does, he doesn't present him an actual case. But it's probably at the same time a position that David feels comfortable in, and that he probably had to take every now and again to be, judge over certain things, or that he wasn't too unfamiliar with. And so he kind of gets into to kind of have, really into a spot where he kind of had to admit his own guilt. And what we see here once again in this story is idolatry, or no, not idolatry, but stealing something, taking something, or really a horrible deed of evil, in kind of an evil deed disguised as graciousness once again. Right, the rich host takes the one ewe lamb and slaughters it so he can be a great host to his guests, right? But at the same time, it's more than cruel, because that other person the poor man only had this one little lamb, and technically, according to the law, you could take somebody else's lambs and slaughter it if you needed to, if there was kind of a need, for you to eat. But it was kind of prohibited if that other person only had one lamb, and it was particularly prohibited if that lamb was your pet. I mean, we see he did everything with that pet. The pet, the lamb probably had a name. Maybe it was Betsy, right? And that rich man just kind of slaughtered Betsy there. That is intense. That's absolutely, it really is kind of disgusting, right? And interestingly enough, right, in chapter, or in verses 7 and 8, we see almost a history of what God has given David, right? I have given you. I've made you king over Israel. I've rescued you from Saul, right? That was a long period of David's life already. I gave you your master's house, your master's wives. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that would have been too little, I would have given you more. Some people say that kind of the point of this verse is almost to say, I have given you all the wives you wanted. You could have taken every single lady in Israel and Judah. And if that wouldn't have been enough, I would have added to you, and doubled that up. But you took the one thing that you couldn't take, and that was a married woman. The grass is always greener on the other side, right? Just absolutely sad. And then in chapter 9, or in verse 9, kind of there's the contrast, right? What God has given David versus, or what David has taken, basically, or what David has done with what God has given him. Why have you despised the word of the Lord? You have struck down Uriah with the sword, and you have taken his wife, and you have killed with the sword killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. And interestingly enough, right, we talked about it at the end of the last chapter. David thought it's over, the war is over, but now the sword shall come unto his house. This was not the end, buddy. This was only the beginning.
He has a price to pay for his
He does have a price to pay. Yeah. And the price is actually at the end of the verses that we just read, right? And it's kind of upsetting, to be honest. I mean, David confesses his sin, right? And kind of moves on, but the child will not, right? It is kind of promised, you will live, but the child will not. And that is not an explanation, and that is an explanation for why Bathsheba's and David's first child dies. It is not an explanation for why every child dies. It's not like, oh no, this is not to be generalized. This is this story. And even though it might seem very unfair to us, in David's time, and I know I've said this before, ultimately everything came from God. Every blessing, every curse, everything was ultimately in the Lord's power. It just kind of was. It's hard to reconcile with the image of a gracious God who, honestly doesn't even give you what you deserve anymore, but gives you a lot more and a lot better things. And who is not, necessarily doing evil things, but back then that's kind of, it was just kind of what happened. And I promised you earlier, I think, an outlook on like the coming chapters of how the sword will kind of devour him. It starts really with the 13th chapter already, because there we will see one of his sons, Amnon, actually likes one of his daughters, Tamar. And Tamar and Amnon are like half-sisters, half-sister and half-brother. And it ends in Amnon actually raping Tamar. Just raping her. That's kind of how it starts. And I think Absalom, who will kill Amnon, And a couple of chapters later, in chapter 18, we will see what Absalom does, because Absalom will stage a rebellion and will actually chase David out of Jerusalem again. So he'll for a period of time that he'll be very successful. And the thing that what David did in private now, right, like what he did in secrecy, sleeping with other men's or husbands' wives, Absalom will do on that very rooftop that David was sleeping on now. And it is said that basically he takes 10 of David's wives out of his harem and will sleep with them on that rooftop. Kind of weird if you think about them being the wives of your father. But it was, this is more than just an act of disobedience. But this is always a power demonstration. If you sleep with the king's wives, or if you go into the king's harem and have your fun there, that's always kind of saying, hey, I have what the king has now. I'm the new king in town, so to speak. So all of that will kind of come down onto David's head from here on out. This is only the beginning of David having to pay for what he did. Pretty gruesome, isn't it? David dealt violence and death, and now violence and death are returning really to his house. Yeah. I think in all of this, if we can take anything away from these verses, other than David was not as great as we thought he was, and he was terrible. But an interesting part too is, though, that at the end of the day, right, David does confess. And from that on, in the middle of this entire mess, right, in the middle of everything that went on here, there's a little bit of life blooming up, right? Okay, David, it's going to be rough, but this is not going to be the end of you anymore, right? You shall live. Even though the child dies, but you shall live. There's still a little bit of hope of life that is coming up. And that can be an example, I think, for us, especially as church, as pastors or as church in general, right? We're also always called to kind of be a prophetic voice to the community. And that oftentimes also means, just kind of like Nathan does to David here, right? To call people out and say, hey, folks, this is not right. This is just not right. That's certainly a part of it, right? And that can bring people to feel guilty or to reject you as church, which might be the much more likelier answer of people today. But I guess it's also an advice for us not to kind of get focused on that kind of judgment aspect and just be like, hey, you did the sinful thing, right? But it's almost like there's a way to repent, there's a way for you to kind of still find the path to life. This is not the end, because really kind of calling somebody to judgment, right? What Nathan does up to that point, right? Up to the point where he says, you are the man, you did this, right? He's still focused on the past. But once David kind of confesses his evil, right, the focus kind of shifts, right? You shall live. We're kind of looking into the future here. You shall live. Bathsheba shall live in the middle of this mess. Even though it'll be hard, but you shall live. The child shall die, but you shall live. If that makes sense. So there's always kind of a twofold. We can learn something here as church, I think, or especially maybe as clergy, to speak judgment, but to also open up a way to repentance and to life again. Both kind of can coexist. Okay, I've blabbered on enough. Let's read the last 10, 11 verses. Can somebody read for me verses 15 through 25? That's the end of the chapter, or at least as far as we kind of read it.
15.
Mm-hmm.
Where it says Bathsheba's
Child dies. Yes.
Okay. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child. David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him, urging him to rise up from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with them. On the 7th day the child died, and the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How then can we tell him the child is dead? He may do himself some harm. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, he perceived that the child was dead. And David said to the servants, Is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. Then David rose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servant said to him, "What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, but when the child died, you rose and ate food." He said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, 'Who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and the child may live.' But now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David consoled his wife Bathsheba and went to her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he named him Solomon. The Lord loved him and sent a message by the prophet Nathan. So he named him Jedediah because of the Lord.
Thank you. Thank you, Kara. Did we learn anything new from these verses? Or any insights you got? Any thoughts?
Well, this is one of the big prices he pays.
Yep. This is also, I think, a very interesting text, right? And we've just seen it in the chapter earlier, right? After Uriah died, that's when the mourning started, right? Bathsheba mourned, and she mourned for 7 days. Here the child is alive, another 7 days, and for those 7 days David mourns. But afterwards, when it was technically customary to mourn, right? Because you usually grieve a person after they're dead, right? He doesn't mourn anymore, but he kind of goes on living. So, I mean, David was off both these entire chapters, right? But once again, what he does here is kind of flying into the face of honestly of the customs of the day, right? I mean, that's just how you deal with death, is you grieve for those 7 days. But he exactly doesn't do it, and for the first time, he might have a great point with that, right? Because he says it's almost kind of like this attitude of like, I'm not happy about it, but what's done is done, and I've grieved over him and tried to change things while he was alive. Right now, let us grasp, life is for the living kind of thing, right? Let us go on and move on, and yeah, sort of thing. It's an interesting take on what actually happens.
Okay, so they named him Solomon.
Yeah.
But then the Lord names him Jedediah.
That's right, which means loved one of God, basically.
Okay,
or God's favorite.
So I'm assuming that's what they call him now. So at what point then does he become Solomon?
He was probably always called Solomon. It's almost like an additional name, like a nickname. Yeah. Something like that, I think. So it was... Who knows? Maybe it was a way to refer to him when he was in the temple, even, or for religious purposes.
Okay.
Yeah, but it definitely, right? It's more than a name, right?
Uh-huh.
If you're called loved one of the Lord, then it's. I mean, it tells us something, right? It foreshadows what's going to happen. It's also a huge promise over somebody's life to say that, right? You are the loved one of the Lord, at least. Back then, in times when maybe not everyone was necessarily loved by the Lord, so to speak. And in contrast to that, honestly, the name Solomon is almost ironic because we at least always kind of trace it back to coming from shalom. In the Hebrew language, the S sound and the sh sound, like they both kind of are the same letter. We distinguish them now after Israel, kind of. After all the Jewish people kind of left Israel, right? Like after Israel was no more, a way for them to preserve the language and know how to honestly speak their own language was they kind of put dots and little, not asterisks, but kind of like tittles or things like that around their letters to kind of distinguish like when is a letter spoken as as S sound or as sh sound, while it was still spoken, and people just kind of knew it. And sometimes the same kind of letter can be an I or an E. It can be a U or an O. They don't have a distinguished vowels, like we do. Okay. It's almost like it's only consonants, and they just know how to read it because they read it every day and they know the words. So whether it's Solomon or Solomon, like Solemn or Shalom, it kind of is the same word. It goes back to the same root. But to basically name this kid like peace, right? Or his peace or something like that is almost ironic, thinking about what's kind of right ahead of them, right? Because we know this is still only the beginning for David and for what is to come. I was going to mention something else, and I still had it a minute ago, and now I forgot.
Getting old.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I am getting old. Yeah. Oh yeah, now I have it. It's certainly, these two chapters are disturbing. They kind of crush the image that we have of David, but they honestly also speak to the greatness of, not just of the story of David, but honestly also of the greatness of the Old Testament and of the Jewish people. It is, you have to respect, or you have to respect it when people kind of preserve even the wrongdoings and the misdeeds of their greatest hero and still kind of lift him up. And in a way, there's truth to that, right? I bet our greatest heroes weren't perfect either and probably did some pretty hefty misdeeds. But there's no need to cover it up. It can kind of live on in the story. Both can coexist here. The gruesome and the great. Both kind of comes together in David, and they move on with him, right? All the way up to the point where, and always hope for a David who would kind of reconquer the land later on, and they were, and Jesus even is kind of called the son of David, right? That's impressive to me. I kind of like that, and I really enjoy it. And I think that's something that demands really some respect.